Have you ever felt like your life looks fine on the outside, but inside, it feels completely empty? Ethan Carter was the kind of person most people would say had his life together. He lived in a small but clean apartment just 10 minutes from downtown, worked a steady 9-to-5 job at a marketing firm, and followed the same routine every single day. He woke up at 6:30 a.m., made his coffee, sat by the window for a few quiet minutes, then drove through the same traffic-filled streets to the same office where the same conversations happened. Over and over again at lunch, his coworkers would laugh, talk about weekend plans, promotions, vacations, things that were supposed to matter, but Ethan would just sit there quietly nodding, smiling at the right moments, pretending he was part of it all. But deep inside, something felt off. It wasn't sadness, not exactly, and it wasn't pain. It was something harder to explain, like a quiet emptiness slowly growing in the background of his life. Every evening, he would return home, drop his keys on the kitchen counter, and sit on the edge of his bed staring at nothing. Sometimes minutes passed, sometimes an hour. He couldn't tell anymore. His phone would light up with notifications, messages from friends, social media updates, reminders of a world that kept moving forward, but he felt strangely disconnected from all of it, as if he was watching his own life from a distance. One night, while standing in front of his bathroom mirror, he looked at his reflection and asked himself a simple question: is this it? His voice was calm, but the question echoed louder than anything he had felt in years. He wasn't struggling financially, he wasn't dealing with any major crisis, and yet everything felt meaningless. The goals he once cared about no longer excited him. The things he used to enjoy felt dull and repetitive. Even small achievements felt empty, as if they no longer had weight. Over the next few days, that question stayed with him, following him through every moment like a shadow. At work, he couldn't focus. At home, he couldn't relax. Even when he tried to distract himself, nothing worked. It was as if something inside him had quietly broken, and he didn't know how to fix it then. One evening, after a long, exhausting day, Ethan walked aimlessly through the city. The air was cool, the streets were quieter than usual, and without thinking, he found himself standing on an old bridge just a few miles from his apartment. He rested his hands on the railing and looked out into the distance. The city lights flickered softly against the dark sky. Everything looked peaceful from where he stood, but inside his mind the same question returned, stronger than before. What's the point of all this? For a long moment, he just stood there, not moving, not thinking, just feeling the weight of that question pressing down on him. And right at that moment, when everything felt completely still, a calm voice behind him said, "Sometimes life feels empty, not because it has no meaning, but because you're looking for it in the wrong place." Ethan slowly turned around, not knowing that this moment was about to change everything. The old man stood a few steps away with his hands resting gently on a wooden cane. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were steady, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Ethan frowned, slightly confused by the calm tone of a stranger speaking so directly into his thoughts. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, his voice low and tired. The man smiled faintly and took a few slow steps closer. "I mean that most people spend their lives searching for meaning in results and achievements, in things they can measure, but meaning does not always live there." Ethan looked away toward the city lights again, unsure whether to listen or walk away. Part of him wanted to ignore it like everything else, but another part of him, the part that had been quietly searching for something, anything, felt drawn to stay. "Then where is it?" Ethan asked after a long pause. The man did not answer right away. Instead, he reached into a small worn bag hanging at his side and pulled out a handful of small brown seeds. He placed them gently into Ethan's hand. "Tomorrow morning, go to the old road behind the hill, just outside the city. It is about 2 miles from here. You will recognize it. No one goes there anymore. I want you to plant these seeds along that road, one by one, every few feet." Ethan stared at the seeds in his palm, then back at the man. "That is it?" he asked, slightly confused. The man nodded. "That is it." Ethan let out a small breath, almost a laugh. "How is that supposed to fix anything?" The man's expression did not change. "It is not supposed to fix anything," he said softly. "Just do it, and come back here in a few days if you still feel the same." Ethan hesitated. The task sounded simple, almost pointless, and yet there was something about the way the man spoke that made it feel different, not like advice, not like motivation, but like something quieter, something that did not need to prove itself. "Why should I listen to you?" Ethan asked. The man's eyes softened. "Because right now you do not have anything else that is working." The words landed without force, but they stayed. Ethan looked down at the seeds again, small, ordinary, almost forgettable, and yet they felt heavier than they should, as if they carried something more than just their size would suggest. He closed his hands slowly around them and slipped them into his pocket. Fine, he said quietly. I will try it. The man gave a small nod as if that was all he needed to. Here, good, he replied, then turned and began walking away without another word. Ethan watched him disappear into the dim light of the street for a moment before turning back toward the bridge. The same question was still there in his mind, but now something else had joined it, a small quiet curiosity. The next morning Ethan woke up earlier than usual. The sky was still pale, and the air felt cooler than it had in days. He sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, holding the seeds in his hand, wondering if this was a waste of time, or if somehow it might lead to something he could not yet see. After a few seconds, he stood up, got dressed, and stepped outside, not knowing that this simple decision was the beginning of something he had been missing for a very long time. The road was exactly where the old man said it would be, a narrow stretch of dry land just beyond the edge of the city. About 2 miles past the last row of houses, Ethan had to walk the final half-mile because the pavement ended and the path turned rough with patches of dirt and scattered stones. There were no cars, no people, no sound except the soft wind moving through the empty space. He stood there for a moment, looking down the long, quiet road. It felt forgotten, like a place the world had quietly moved on from. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small seeds, holding them in his hand. He could not help but think how strange this all was. A grown man walking alone on an abandoned road just to plant something that might never grow. This is pointless, he muttered under his breath, but still he knelt down, pressing the first seed into the dry soil. He covered it gently with dirt, stood up, took a few steps forward, and did the same thing again, one seed every few feet, just like the old man had said. At first, he moved slowly, his mind filled with doubt. Each step felt heavier than it should, as if he was carrying the weight of his own thoughts with him. After planting a few seeds, he stopped and looked back. The road looked exactly the same. Nothing had changed. There was no sign of progress, no proof that anything he was doing mattered. What am I even doing here? He said quietly, shaking his head. Part of him wanted to turn around and go home, forget the old man, forget the seeds, forget all of it. But something inside him, a small quiet voice, pushed him to continue. So he kept going, step by step, seed by seed. The sun began to rise slowly, casting a soft light across the road, and as the minutes passed, something unexpected happened. His thoughts started to slow down. The constant noise in his mind, the questions, the doubts, the emptiness began to fade into the background. He was no longer thinking about his job or his past or the future. He was simply there in that moment, walking, stopping, kneeling, planting, standing, moving again. The repetition was simple, almost calming. After about an hour, Ethan reached the end of the road. He looked at the last seed in his hand, paused for a second, then placed it into the ground. Just like the others, he stood up and took a deep breath, looking out at the empty land around him. Nothing looked different. The road was still dry, still quiet, still forgotten. But somehow he felt slightly lighter, not happier, not fulfilled, just a little less heavy than before. Maybe I just needed to get out of my head for a while, he thought as he turned around and began walking back toward the city. The same doubts slowly started to return, creeping back into his mind step by step. By the time he reached his apartment, the feeling of emptiness had not disappeared. It was still there, just as quiet and familiar as before. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he replayed the day in his mind, the road, the seeds, the silence. None of it made sense, and yet he could not ignore the small shift he had felt while he was there. It was not a solution, it was not an answer, but it was something different. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan fell asleep, not because he was exhausted, but because his mind had finally gone quiet, even if only for a little. While the next morning, Ethan woke up at the same time, but something felt slightly different. The heaviness was still there, but it was quieter, less overwhelming, as if it had stepped back just enough for him to breathe. He sat on the edge of his bed, holding the empty feeling in his chest, trying to understand what had changed and what had not. The road came back into his mind, the silence, the simple act of planting the seeds, the way his thoughts had slowed down without effort. For a brief moment he considered ignoring it, telling himself it was nothing, just a distraction. But then he remembered the old man's words and the strange calm he had felt out there. Without fully deciding, he stood up, got dressed, and stepped outside again. The walk felt familiar this time, the same streets, the same turns, the same quiet stretch where the city slowly faded away. When he reached the dirt path, the air felt cooler and the world felt distant, as if he had stepped into a different space, separate from everything else. He followed the road to the place where he had planted the seeds the day before. and stopped looking down at the ground. Nothing had changed. The soil looked exactly the same, dry, and still there were no signs of growth, no green, no movement, just the same empty road. Of course nothing changed, he said quietly. A small part of him felt disappointed, even though he knew it was too soon. He walked a little further, scanning the ground, as if expecting something to appear, but there was nothing. After a few seconds he let out a breath and shook his head. This is exactly like everything else, he thought. You put effort into something and get nothing back. The familiar feeling began to return, slowly filling the space inside him again. The same quiet emptiness, the same question. Without an answer, he turned around, ready to leave, convinced that this was just another pointless attempt. But after a few steps, he stopped. Something felt unfinished, not on the road, but inside him. He looked back at the empty path, then down at his hands. They felt still, and for a moment, he realized something he had not noticed before. Yesterday, when he was planting the seeds, he had not been thinking about results. He had not been thinking about success or failure. He had just been doing one simple action at a time, and in that space his mind had been quiet. Now standing there expecting something to happen, the noise had returned, the doubt, the frustration, the need for meaning. Maybe the problem is not the road, he thought slowly. Maybe it is how I am looking at it. The idea felt strange, but it stayed with him. He walked back to the starting point and stood there again, looking down the long empty road. It had not changed, but somehow his perspective felt slightly different. Without overthinking, he knelt down and picked up a small stick from the ground and began loosening the soil around where he had planted the seeds the day before. He moved slowly, carefully, not because he expected something to grow, but because the action itself felt steady. Each movement was simple, clear, real, and for a moment his thoughts faded again. The questions did not disappear completely, but they softened, losing their sharp edge as he worked. The time passed without him noticing. The sun rose higher, the air warmed slightly, and the silence around him remained calm. When he finally stood up again, he looked at the road once more, still empty, still quiet, still unchanged, but this time it did not feel as heavy. He did not feel satisfied or fulfilled, but there was a small shift, something subtle, something almost invisible, as if a part of him had started to move, even if everything around him stayed the same. The following days passed in a quiet rhythm. Ethan did not fully understand. Each morning, he found himself returning to the same road, walking the same path, kneeling in the same places where he had planted the seeds. At first, he told himself he was just being consistent, just finishing what he had started, but deep down, he knew something else was pulling him back. It was not hope, because he did not expect anything to grow. It was not excitement, because there was nothing new to see. It was something simpler, something calmer. Each time he stepped onto that empty road, the noise inside his mind softened again. The constant questions, the pressure to find meaning, the frustration of feeling stuck, they all faded into the background as he focused on small actions, loosening the soil, adjusting the ground, clearing small rocks from the path. None of it felt important, and yet it felt real. One morning, as he worked, his hands moving slowly through the dry dirt, a thought came into his mind. Why does this feel better than everything else? He paused for a moment, sitting back on his heels, looking at the ground beneath him. There was still no sign of growth, no green, no life, just the same dry earth. And yet, something inside him had started to shift in a way he could not explain. Later that day, as he sat in his apartment, the familiar emptiness returned, but it felt different now. It no longer felt like a heavy weight pressing down on him. It felt more like a quiet space, something open, something unfinished. He noticed it without reacting to it the way he used to, and for the first time, he did not try to escape it. He simply sat there, breathing slowly, letting the feeling exist without judging it. The next morning, he returned to the road again, this time without questioning it. As much his steps felt more natural, his movements more steady. As he reached the middle of the path, he stopped. Suddenly something caught his attention. He leaned down closer to the ground, narrowing his eyes for a second. He was not sure if he was imagining it, but then he saw it, a tiny green sprout barely breaking through the surface of the soil. It was small, fragile, almost invisible, but it was there. Ethan stared at it in silence, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. It actually grew, he whispered softly. He looked around, scanning the ground, and after a few moments he noticed another one, and then another, each one just as small, just as easy to miss, but they were real. Something had changed, not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but slowly, quietly, over time. Ethan sat there looking at the small sprouts, feeling something he had not felt in a long time. It was not happiness, not exactly. It was something deeper, something closer to meaning, but not the kind he had been searching for before. This was not something he had found. It was something that had appeared while he was doing something else, without realizing it. And in that moment, a quiet question formed in his mind, not heavy, not overwhelming, but clear. If something this small can grow without me noticing, what else in my life have I been missing? The sight of the small green sprout stayed with Ethan long after he left the road that morning. As he walked back toward the city, everything looked the same as before, the same streets, the same buildings, the same people moving quickly from one place to another, but something inside him had shifted in a quiet but undeniable way. The emptiness he used to feel so strongly was still there, but it no longer felt like a dead end. It felt more like a space that could be filled not all at once, but slowly. Over time later that day, as he sat in his apartment, he kept thinking about how the seeds had grown without him noticing. He had not stood there waiting. He had not checked every hour. He had simply shown up, done the work, and left, and somehow that had been enough. Maybe that is the problem, he thought. I have been waiting to feel something before I do anything. The idea felt simple, but it stayed with him the next morning. Ethan returned to the road again, this time with a different mindset. He was not looking for more sprouts. He was not expecting anything new. He simply walked to the same places, knelt down, and continued caring for the soil, moving small rocks aside, making sure the ground stayed soft enough for whatever was growing underneath. As he worked, he began to notice something else. The road was no longer completely empty. In the distance, a man was walking, slowly taking small, careful steps, as if he was just passing through. Ethan watched him for a moment, then returned to his work, not thinking much of it. After a few minutes, the man approached closer and slowed down near the area where the small sprouts had started to appear. He looked down at the ground, then back at Ethan. "Did you plant these?" he asked. Ethan paused for a second, then nodded. "Yes." The man smiled faintly. "I walk this path every morning. It used to feel lifeless, but now it feels different," he said before continuing on his way. Ethan sat there for a moment, replaying the words in his mind. "It feels different," he repeated quietly. He had not thought about that. He had been so focused on his own thoughts, his own emptiness, his own search for meaning, that he never considered how his small actions might affect something beyond himself. As the days passed, more small sprouts began to appear scattered along the road, still small, still fragile, but growing steadily, and every now and then Ethan would notice someone walking along the path. Someone who had no idea where the plants came from, but still paused to look at them, or simply walked a little slower, as if the road had become something more than just a forgotten place. One afternoon, Ethan sat on the side of the path, watching the sunlight fall across the small green leaves, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to ask what the point of it all was. He was not chasing an answer. He was not trying to force meaning into his life. He was simply there doing something small, something simple, and somehow that was enough. And in that quiet moment, another realization began to form, not loud, not dramatic, but clear. Maybe meaning does not come from what you get. Maybe it comes from what you quietly give without expecting anything back. And as that thought settled into his mind, Ethan felt something he had not felt in a very long time, a sense of calm that did not depend on anything outside of him. Days turned into a quiet routine that Ethan no longer questioned. Each morning, he walked the same path. But now his steps felt lighter, not because his life had suddenly changed, but because he had stopped expecting it to change all at once. The small green sprouts slowly grew into stronger plants, their leaves stretching wider, their color becoming deeper and more alive. The once empty road was no longer just a dry, forgotten path. It had begun to feel like something in progress, something quietly transforming without needing attention or recognition. One morning, as Ethan arrived, he noticed something new. A woman was standing a few yards ahead of him. She was looking down at the plants with a soft expression on her face, as if she had just discovered something unexpected. Ethan slowed his steps, not wanting to interrupt, but the woman turned and noticed him. "Did you do this?" she asked gently. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I planted some seeds a while ago," the woman smiled. "I have been coming here for weeks. This place used to feel so empty, but now it feels peaceful, like something is growing not just here, but inside me too." Her words caught Ethan off guard. He had never thought about it that way. He had only been focused on his own experience, his own quiet change, but now he was seeing something else. His actions had created something beyond himself, something that touched people he did not even know. After the woman left, Ethan stood there for a long moment, looking at the path around him. People were starting to pass through more often. Some walked slowly, some paused for a moment, some simply looked around, as if they could feel the difference without fully understanding it. And for the first time, Ethan realized that what he had created was not just about The plants, it was about the space, the feeling, the quiet shift that others could step into without even knowing why. He sat down near the edge of the path, watching as the sunlight moved gently across the leaves, and a thought came into his mind, clear and steady. I spent so much time asking why my life felt empty, but I never asked what I was giving to it. The question stayed with him, not as pressure, but as understanding. He thought about his old routine, the way he used to move through each day, waiting for something to make him feel alive, waiting for meaning to appear, as if it was something outside of him, something he had to find now. He saw it differently. Meaning was not something that arrived fully formed, it was something that grew slowly through small, consistent actions that often felt simple, even pointless at the beginning. As the day went on, Ethan continued his work, clearing small debris, adjusting the soil, making sure the plants had space to grow. And as he moved, he noticed how natural it all felt. There was no resistance, no frustration, no need to force himself to keep going. He was simply present, doing what needed to be done, and in that presence he felt a quiet sense of purpose, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady and real. And as the sun began to set, casting a warm light across the now living path, Ethan stood up and looked at what had once been an empty road. And in that moment, he understood something he had been searching for all along, not as a sudden answer, but as a quiet truth that had been there the entire time, waiting for him to see it. The next evening, as the sky slowly darkened, Ethan found himself walking back to the bridge where everything had started. The air felt familiar, cool and calm, and the city lights began to flicker on one by one, just as they had that night. He rested his hands on the railing and looked out into the distance, but this time the feeling inside him was different. The emptiness that once felt overwhelming had softened into something quieter, something that no longer demanded an answer. He stood there for a moment, thinking about the road, the plants, the people who now walked through that space without knowing how it had begun. And for the first time, he did not feel disconnected from the world around him. He felt part of it, not in a big dramatic way, but in a simple, steady way, like he had finally found a place within it. After a few minutes, he heard the sound of slow footsteps behind him, and without turning, he already knew who it was. "You came back," the old man said calmly. Ethan gave a small nod. "I did," he replied softly. There was a brief silence before Ethan spoke again. "I did what you told me. I planted the seeds, and I kept going back even when nothing changed, and now things are growing. People are coming there. It feels different." He paused for a moment, searching for the right words. "But I still do not fully understand why." The old man stepped beside him, resting his hands on the railing as well. "That is because you are still trying to understand it with the same mindset you had before," he said gently. Ethan looked at him, slightly confused. "Then how should I understand it?" The old man smiled faintly. "Tell me, when you first planted the seeds, what were you expecting?" Ethan thought for a second. "Nothing, I just did it because you told me to." The old man nodded. "And when you went back the next day, what did you feel?" Ethan sighed. Frustration. It felt pointless, like nothing was happening. "Exactly," the old man said. "At first you acted without expectation, and your mind became quiet. Then you started looking for results, and the noise returned. That is how most people live. They do things only to get something in return. And when nothing happens immediately, they feel empty again." Ethan listened carefully. The words felt simple, but they carried weight. But when you stopped focusing on the result and returned to the action, something changed inside you before anything changed on the outside. The old man continued. Ethan looked down at his hands, thinking about those moments on the road, the quiet, the simplicity, the absence of pressure. "So the meaning was never in the plants," Ethan said slowly. The old man shook his head gently. "The plants are only a reflection. The real change happened within you. You learned how to be present, how to act without needing immediate reward, how to create something small and let it grow in its own time." Ethan took a deep breath. The pieces began to come together, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet understanding that felt steady and real. "So meaning is not something you find out there," he said. "It is something you build here," he added, placing his hand lightly against his chest. The old man smiled. "Meaning is not something you chase. It is something that forms when your actions and your attention are in the right place." They both stood there in silence for a moment, watching the lights of the city stretch into the distance. And for the first time, Ethan did not feel like he was searching for something missing. He felt like he was already on the path without needing to know exactly where it would lead. The following morning, Ethan returned to the road as he always did, but this time, he walked with a quiet awareness that had not been there before. The plants had grown taller, their leaves stretching toward the light, some of them now strong enough to stand against the wind, and the once empty path had become a place where people passed through not because they had to but because they wanted to. Ethan watched as a young boy ran ahead of his mother, stopping to look at the green leaves with curiosity, while an older man walked slowly behind them, taking his time, as if the path itself invited him to slow down. Ethan stood there for a moment, taking it all in, and he realized something simple but powerful. None of these people knew him, none of them knew why this path had changed, and yet they were experiencing something different because of something small he had done without expecting anything in return. He knelt down and gently touched one of the leaves, feeling its texture, its quiet strength, and in that moment, he understood something that words had never fully explained to him before. Life had never been empty, it had only felt empty, because he had been waiting for it to give him something before he was willing to give anything to it. He had been searching for meaning in outcomes and recognition in results that could prove something had value, but the truth was much simpler. Meaning was never something that arrived fully formed. It was something that grew slowly through attention, through action, through the willingness to do something small, even when it felt like it did not matter. He stood up and looked down the path once more, no longer seeing it as a project or a task, but as a reflection of something deeper, something that had changed within him over time. He was no longer asking what the point of everything was. He was simply living each moment with a quiet sense of purpose, not because everything was perfect, but because he no longer needed it to be perfect to feel something real. As the sun rose higher, casting a warm light across the path, Ethan began walking slowly, not rushing, not thinking about where he needed to be next, just moving forward step by step. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace, not because he had found all the answers, but because he no longer needed to chase them. The search itself had changed him, and in that change he had found something far more valuable than a single answer. He had found a way to live without feeling lost. And as he reached the end of the path, he paused for a moment, looking back at what had once been empty and now quietly alive. And in that silence, a final thought settled into his mind, clear, steady, and true. Life does not become meaningful when everything makes sense. It becomes meaningful when you choose to create something even when it does not, and then trust that in time it will grow into something you never expected.